Hi, and thanks for joining me today. Today we're going to be talking about the shoulder, and we're going to be talking about what the shoulder is capable of doing and how we can protect the shoulder when we are instructing our yoga classes. First of all, let's take a look at the shoulder. Now, this is a shoulder model, but it's not actually anatomically correct, as you will probably notice, but it'll be good enough for now. So the first thing that we'll note is the clavicle here. Now, the clavicle should be attached to the sternum, and the attachment of the sternum and the clavicle is called the sternoclavicular joint. So this particular joint is part of the shoulder girdle because it holds everything together. The clavicle then runs all the way over to the acromion of the scapula. The acromioclavicular joint is this joint right here where the clavicle and the acromion connect. Here you see the scapula, the flat triangular part that sits on the back of the body. And on the underside of the scapula, there is a socket called the glenoid. The glenoid is the surface that the humerus bone connects to in the glenohumeral joint. Now together, these joints make up the shoulder girdle. We have two shoulders, one on the right and one on the left, and each of the shoulders is exactly the same. Now, there are anatomical differences depending on your bone structure or your genetics, and some people actually have more space in these joints than others. But for the most part, most everyone's anatomy has a similar range of motion. From a neutral position, if my palms are facing my thighs and hips, I can move my arms up into flexion, and then I can move them back into extension and back to neutral. Or I can go through extension, up and over to flexion, and back to neutral. I can elevate my shoulders or depress my shoulders. I can push something away, protracting my shoulders, or I can pull something toward me, retracting my shoulders. These are all movements that we do all day long in our day-to-day life. As we grow up and become more sedentary, we lose some of the range of motion in the shoulder girdle, which is why it's very helpful to practice yoga asana. Yoga asana gives us many different opportunities to increase our range of motion and create health and stability in the shoulder girdle. If we spend all of our time typing like this, we are in internal rotation, rounding into flexion of the spine, and we're not moving our shoulders into flexion. We're just really staying here in this neutral place while we're typing on our computers. If we're scrolling through Instagram, we're doing the same sort of thing. So when we move our body in a way that helps us to encourage all of the different movements in a joint, we are creating stability, flexibility, and strength while maintaining a healthy range of motion. Flexibility is my ability to move in the joint to its full range of motion, as I'm doing here. Strength is my ability to contain that joint and to make sure it's stable. Stability requires both strength and flexibility, and our yoga practice helps to get us there. Sometimes our students will experience shoulder impingement. Shoulder impingement occurs when one of the ligaments that holds the shoulder joint together becomes frayed. This fray stresses the ligament and causes pain. Typically, we can identify if this is what our students are experiencing by asking them to move their arms up towards their ears. Typically, if someone is experiencing shoulder impingement, they will have pain somewhere along the arc, typically right in here, in this area. It will start to be painful or hurt. Now, it's important for us to remember what our scope of work is. It's not our scope of work to diagnose our students. But if our students come to us and they say that they're having pain, and we ask them to raise their arms up over their head, and they say they experience pain anywhere from here to here, this arc is typically the arc of shoulder impingement. And we can refer them to a chiropractor or a physical therapist to get a diagnosis. Yoga teachers do not diagnose. The only reason I'm sharing this information with you is so that you understand what it might be and you can direct them to the appropriate professional provider to help them to get the right diagnosis. There are all sorts of different injuries that can happen in the shoulder. Shoulder impingement is by far the most common injury, but we can also see dislocated shoulders. We can also see frozen shoulders. So there are many different injuries that can occur in the shoulder joint itself. It's important to note that the shoulder is the most unstable joint in the body. The humerus sits against the glenoid, and although it is connected with soft tissue, it's not a very strong and stable joint. Both the shoulder joint and the hip joint are ball and socket joints, which essentially means that they move in a ball and socket relationship. The glenoid is so shallow, there's not really a lot of socket to move within, and that's why there can be instability in the shoulders. When we're in external rotation with the palms facing forward, the humerus bone and the glenoid are in the most congruent relationship. When we internally rotate, you can actually feel a little bit of stress and strain, maybe some pulling even across the back. This is the most incongruent relationship. This is why we see external rotation in almost all flexion exercises we do in yoga with our shoulders. When we're in a warrior one or a downward facing dog or any arm balance, we're going to be in external rotation in flexion. This simply means that the upper arm, the attachment of the humerus to the glenoid, is in an externally rotated position, and the arm itself is coming into flexion at the point of the shoulder joint. We see extension in the shoulders when we're in chaturanga or when we're in poses like humble warrior with the arms interlaced behind us. Extension can be problematic for some people who are hypermobile. Sometimes we see hyperextension, where the humeral head moves forward and puts pressure on the soft tissue that holds the shoulder joint together. This is actually one of the reasons we want to avoid jumping back into plank. When we jump back into plank, we are putting a lot of unnecessary stress on the shoulder joint itself. And this unnecessary stress can cause weakening in the shoulder joint, and ultimately it can cause the shoulder joint to experience frays or tears in the ligaments and soft tissues. When this happens, we run the risk of experiencing shoulder impingement, which is an avoidable injury in this case. The shoulder moves in many different ways. I highly encourage you to consider what's going on in your yoga practice. Oftentimes, when we're in flexion, we're also in protraction. Protraction is when we feel a slight flexion in the upper back and the thoracic spine to stabilize the shoulders as we push something away. One of the movements we don't see a lot or feel a lot in our body is retraction in yoga asana. Retraction in yoga asana is when we pull the shoulders back onto the back body. But when we're in poses that require strength and stability in the shoulder girdle, and we come into retraction, we see a hollowing in the back between the shoulder blades. And this is an indication that the shoulders are less stable. So we want to avoid that. I hope this video has been helpful for you. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions about anatomy and physiology as they pertain to the shoulder. Be well, yogis. Namaste.